Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, I know there's more energy here in Delhi than this. My name is Justin Bakule. As Amit said, I'm the Executive Director of the Shared Value Initiative, and what a pleasure and treat it is to be here with all of you today. I must confess, this is my third year in a row. I know for some of you, this is maybe your first Shared Value Initiative India Summit that you've been to, but we've been doing this for 3 years. And I must tell you that when I come here and get to participate in this, I almost feel a little bit selfish. And I feel selfish because I get to learn so much from each and every one of you in the room about what you're doing, about the interesting initiatives that are emerging here in India. We had a great morning with our partner community, the key partners of the Shared Value Initiative India, sharing experiences, talking about initiatives that have scaled, that are changing lives right now. And for me, it's just a great opportunity to get updated and learn about what's going on. And I encourage you, I'll be here all day throughout the whole event. Please come up to me, share with me what you're doing, because my role within the initiative really is to try to understand shared value as a concept and how it's being realized and implemented in all corners of the globe. So I sort of get the liberal arts education, if you will, in shared value, meaning I see a lot of things, but I don't get to go deep because I'm looking around the whole world. But as Amit can certainly attest, over the last 3 years, I've taken a lot of what I've learned here and imparted it in other places around the world. In fact, the first year we had the summit here in Delhi, we had an inspirational session that featured a high school girl named Rajul. And as Amit can tell you, when we had our Shared Value Summit in New York with about 450 people and a few thousand joining on live stream, I talked about her story there in the opening of that event. Last year, I met the folks from Jaipur Rugs and learned about their story. Was really impressed last year, picking up on the theme of equity and empowerment. Last year, there was a panel of 3 young social entrepreneurs, all females, all talking about initiatives that they were working on, but also talking about how their work was helping to inform and influence and try to change gender dynamics in India. So I always find myself quite inspired and really look forward to learning from all of you today. Let me start by offering a couple of thoughts on how I see the global business environment. So let me pull up out of the Indian context for a moment and give you a sense of the progress of shared value around the world. From a U.S. perspective, the reality is right now, despite, how shall we say, a little bit of uncertainty, can I call it, in the national political dialogue. Is uncertainty polite enough, I suppose? Uncertain political environment. The reality is the U.S. business environment, the environment for large multinational corporations is fantastic. Across almost all sectors, corporate earnings are up. The Dow Jones Industrial Index just passed 24,000. The market has grown substantially since President Trump's election, a long series of strong performance. Massive tax cut on the way for U.S. businesses to try to spur additional growth. Unemployment's incredibly low. And frankly, just a very strong operating environment for U.S. businesses. I think that's been productive around the world, including reductions in regulations, too, across many, many industries. Now, that's the sort of good news on a macro perspective. I think the thing that's so interesting, though, for me, is how frequently and with what kind of ongoing cadence we see business and society questions being raised. And importantly, what I would say, as we start to think about them, and you will hear about them in the Indian context today, but issues of equity and gender equity, racial equity and racial dimensions, pathways to employment for folks in society who may be underserved or not have the same opportunities in life. What I think is so interesting is not just that these are important topics of conversation in the U.S. and globally, but importantly, they're being tied to business issues. And business leaders are starting to more fundamentally understand and grapple with the implications of these challenges to their business. And to me, That's the right question. In fact, when we started this work with the initiative 5 years ago, I think the idea that companies and the business models could be used to solve social problems was, to put it simply, more controversial. And the traditional view that solving or working on social issues was the purview of government and civil society, and that companies should create employment and pay taxes, that was a much more commonly held view. So we spent a lot of time trying to defend and explain examples of how companies could really contribute to solving social problems. Fortunately, my sense is that that dialogue has really turned. And now, again, with CEOs across these topics, you see comments, you see participation in the dialogue. And importantly for me, this goes past places where companies have engaged for a longer period of time, say, for instance, climate change, which I think around the climate issue, companies have long understood that that can impose limitations on growth opportunities and so forth. So I think there's conversation in a way that there hasn't been before, and a prominence of business leaders in these dialogues that you haven't seen. Now, that's the good news. I think the more challenging news is that there still is a gulf. There's still a big difference between the headlines and the engagement on the topic and what's actually happened within companies. And I still think it's very easy to see the difference between the rhetoric and the talk and actual action and delivery of social impact and business results. So good news, awareness up. The more challenging thing is, how do we get to further action and scale? And as Amit said, for me, I think ultimately this is a question about competitiveness and how businesses will compete in the future. Competing on the basis of helping solve social problems that are fundamentally related to their business in ways that provide value for them and for society. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to give you a couple of examples for specifically how this will happen. How do companies achieve scale? What are the components that we see of success? And the ask I have for all of you, look, the power of these kind of convenings is that we have the people assembled in this room who can actually go out to organizations, whether it's a social enterprise that's rapidly growing, whether it's a large multinational corporation thinking about what issues to engage on, or whether it's partners from government or from nonprofits. We have the people assembled in the room here in this context that can actually do something in practice with these ideas. So I want to ask each of you to honestly reflect for a moment on how far you think your organization has gone to embedding social issues into core competitive strategy, into how you compete. And then from there, because strategy is not enough, how much have you gone from linking those issues to actually operationalizing it in your businesses? How does it become a part of how your organization actually operates? And then, as Amit said, I think in the Indian context in particular, for companies, under the CSR law, how do you view the full portfolio of activities that you're engaging with in society? Do you still view the CSR law as a regulation and a cost imposed upon you that requires a check to be written every year because the government of India has mandated it? Or do you view that as part of a portfolio along with business investments that create a context and an environment for your business success? So how do you view and engage in that portfolio? So I want to talk about two quick examples that I think start to illustrate these questions and these points. Connection to strategy, operationalizing it, and the enabling conditions within the business that are required for success. And finally, what does leadership look like under those conditions? To me, these are the businesses who are starting to become more sophisticated in how they're dealing with these issues. And I'm going to tell two stories in parallel against about two different companies to give you a visceral sense of the changes they're making. One is Enel, which is a $100 billion Italian utility company that's in many ways very traditional, as you think of, provider of energy, was formerly the state-owned energy enterprise in Italy and with a big substantial business in Spain. That's one. And the other one I want to talk about is Walmart. And Walmart, by revenue, is the largest company in the world and has people have many preconceived notions about Walmart and its approach to cost management. And I think we'll be somewhat surprised at how they're more holistically thinking about social issues related to their business. So what does centrality of corporate strategy look like in these two businesses? To me, this is the first critical litmus test that you see of how serious companies are. So in the case of NL, it's really about transforming their business model. And their business is in energy generation and distribution. NL wanted to grow their business from state-owned enterprise and decided to expand to new markets. They thought that the future of energy was in renewable energy. So they grew in Latin America, North America, importantly both developed and emerging markets. And the commitment that they made to that growth strategy, that new business growth strategy, was to do that 100% in renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, and so forth. Now, that would be, I suppose, somewhat interesting in and of itself. It's a way for the business to grow outside of its traditional means. But really, the way they saw it and the way it worked, and this is why it's so central to their strategy, is as they were developing that business, they were learning about how to run basically a new energy generation business. And they used what they've learned to now commit back in Italy to replacing all of their fixed assets, $20 billion in fixed assets in coal and oil and gas, traditional energy, thermal energy generation, that they will now change over and replace because they've learned and they've innovated within this new business model in emerging markets and in the United States to move their business into something else where they see energy going. Clearly, for an energy distribution generation business, the source of that energy is central to competitive strategy. For Walmart, it's a little bit of a different situation. It has a long history in sustainability, minimizing costs, working with suppliers on resource side, on logistics, transportation, long history of saving money. Walmart recognized that they had another pressing business problem, and it was how to get enough people to work in Walmart stores as a pathway to employment. And you can imagine you could be the most efficient store possible, but if you have no one to work there, there's a bit of a business risk. So they've started figuring out how to work with underserved youth and basically build a pipeline of employment into Walmart stores. And I think importantly, and this is a place where it would be contrary to maybe long-held beliefs about Walmart, how does that actually become a productive living wage pathway with benefits for Walmart to providing these opportunities? Again, store labor, huge cost to the business. Turnover, huge cost to the business. Thinking about a social issue in business terms. Now, what does it look like to operationalize these key priorities? Because the strategy is fine, but without actually deep work on operationalizing how this works within the business, not within a separate CSR group, not within sustainability group that's somehow doing something different, but within the business itself. So in the case of NL, they looked at their development pipeline. They looked at how they identify new places for energy generation, what the grid or distributed grid technology looks like, what community development looks like, the construction process across the whole life cycle of energy generation, and infuse this idea of not only what kind of energy it was going to be, but what the engagement with what those communities would look like. In the case of Walmart, it's basically deep work with social service providers and other nonprofits who are working very closely with underserved youth and figuring out how did we have to change employment processes? How did we have to change hiring? So these are deep HR questions and deep store operations questions, and they can be things that may seem simple to people who take these things for granted, but how do youth like this get to work? Is there public transportation? If someone's young but a young single parent, how do they provide for childcare while the parent is at work? These kinds of deep questions that are about matching up what the business knows how to do with the needs of the people that they want to employ. Again, driven from a point of saying, we have an employment problem. And then number three, enabling conditions are within the business. So how is this supported? And frankly, you know, over the last 5 years, what I've seen is that I think many of these issues run into problems when they meet the first two conditions, but we haven't changed the elements within the business that help support them. Well, what do I mean by that? Where do these initiatives sit within an organizational structure? Who's responsible for them? Have we changed their incentives of how they're remunerated or how they're rewarded or what kind of risks they can take for meeting both business and social objectives? And what you find is that if these issues have not been changed within a business, and this is the much harder work to do, frankly, then the ideas that you have, the initiatives you have, cannot actually scale and grow within the business. So I know we have a representative here from Becton Dickinson today. Let me give one example from BD when we were working with them. And we talked about the need in BD to have shared value, meeting unmet health needs as a source of new business opportunities for them. How could you build that into strategic planning processes around the business to make sure that it was being planned on an annual basis, what the targets were, and that the goals were met? Sounds simple enough. Build it into the process. Well, as we started working with them, here's what becomes clear. Well, there's one strategic planning process at headquarters in New Jersey. There's one for every functional area, marketing, finance, HR, and so forth. There's one for every product line that they operate in. There's one for every country that they operate in. So all of a sudden, something that seems very simple, that even if it's important to the company, relies on an actual change process within the company for it to be fully adopted. Now, the last point that often is the one that people start with, but I've put at the end on purpose, then is within these companies, what does the visibility of leadership look like? What's the position of the leaders of these organizations and their approach to embracing these issues within the company? In Walmart, again, the largest company in the world, Doug McMillon, the CEO, wrote in his annual report letter about the importance of employment, about the importance of these issues to overall performance of Walmart. That's a pretty big signal. The CEO of NL joined us last year at our summit, and I thought in a very amazing way, I know a number of you were here, was quite humble in the sense of talking about not all the wonderful successes that he could have trumpeted. He was, in fact, the one who ran the green power business, which learned and taught the business how they could be successful in alternative energy sources. No, in fact, if anything, what he focused on were all the many ways that a large corporation, and in his case, his corporation, had failed in their efforts to transform. All the examples of trying to acquire new energy technologies and how in a big company that hadn't more fundamentally changed, how that actually squelched and killed many of those ideas. So there was a humble sort of steward kind of leadership about what was required for the company to adopt and learn new things and to actually transform. So those are some of the key elements that we see of what it looks like for a company to have social issues as central to competitiveness, central to core strategy, and in addition to really be thinking about what this new positioning would look like of a business and society. One of the things that we're doing as an initiative then to match all of this is we are building a shared value enterprise diagnostic. And we're working with a data visualization firm called Tableau. Because one of the things I've learned over the last 5 years is that I think, again, the idea and the concept and the work that's being done is great, but the key to actually unlocking scale, the key to going back to my first point of awareness of the role of companies has gone up, the action is still kind of in the middle. I think the key to that is driving this enterprise level change. So across all these dimensions we're talking about, we are working with the data company to basically collect this information across all of our partner companies. And as we roll this out, it'll certainly be available to all the companies involved here as well, so that we can help them track and understand their progress on the enterprise level change and how it unlocks their ability to deliver both business and social results. So in closing, I want to come back to the demand I had for all of you, which is to ask yourselves and think about these elements of what it looks like to be a shared value enterprise, to what it looks like to fundamentally embed these issues in your business and take them on, and to ask yourself really how far have you gone in that adoption cycle, and what are the things that you need? What would be your plan to unlock greater shared value creation within your own organization, or importantly, within partnerships with nonprofits and governments and others that you may be working with? So as I said at the outset, I'm very much looking forward to today. Again, selfishly, I learned so much from all of you. I look forward to hearing about your examples in the panels here, and look forward to talking to you in breaks. And I think we have some time for Q&A.
So Justin, I know you guys have done some very interesting things in collective work with corporations. The stuff I've looked at, the more collective it is, the more it tends to be aligned with the business. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a whole bunch of challenges out there where alignment isn't the key. Safaricom almost canceled M-Pesa because they didn't think it was aligned enough. The CEO stepped in and said, I don't care if it's not aligned, we're doing it anyway.
Right.
Literally, had they made the decision, wouldn't have happened.
Right.
So where do you see the opportunities, and this is particularly true in India, with scale opportunities that in order to be funded would need a half dozen or a dozen companies to combine their efforts on an opportunity that
they don't have the deep knowledge of how to create social impact. They don't have the deep knowledge about how to measure change in social conditions. There's all sorts of things that don't intuitively reside within a corporation, but that are needed in these initiatives. We ran for 2 years a working group of 20 international NGOs, all with an eye on exactly what you're saying, which is also how do we get out of this relationship of grantee-grantor? Oh, it's the NGO here with their hand out for a check. How do we actually co-create these partnerships that tap into what the NGO needs and desires to meet its mission, but that's remunerated in a way that's consistent with the value that they are oftentimes creating for that company? And how do we put that match together? Honestly, if anything, I think in many ways the NGOs were further along in their understanding of how to try to accomplish that than many of the companies that we're working with. And that really gets back to the point of how far along have we actually come.
Thank you. Mr. Jalan, very quick question.
Yeah, my name is N.K. Jalan. In Indian context, I find that rural livelihood is the biggest problem in our country. Mm-hmm. So do you have any such example in your global initiatives which has really created rural livelihood with local resources?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and happy to, I'll answer quickly and then happy to talk to you when we have a break about some examples. But as I said, we've worked in Cote d'Ivoire for almost the last 10 years on cocoa growing in a program that was adopted as an industry program for about 100,000 cocoa farmers in the western part of Cote d'Ivoire. And it was exactly as I've heard it described here, which is how do you make that a livelihood? And as it turns out, and I'm sure within your question, you know, choosing a rural life is both about income, but also about the supporting components of that community. So it quickly grows past just, can we grow something of value? Can we link it to a value chain? Can we create an income for a farmer that makes a sustainable life? Those things are absolutely all true. But then does that feel like a viable community with infrastructure, with education, with healthcare? And you quickly emerge from just a question of, you know, can we grow something that helps someone's livelihood? Do we have a livable community? And what's the vision of that community? And within that, how do we then, again, back to this point, how do we figure out then what's the role of the company within that? What's the role of government? What's the role of civil society in sort of delivering that vision of rural communities? But happy to talk to you also about that over a break.
So.